We're very lucky to have this team of panelists here today, and the conversation that we'll be having today will be revolving around the implementation of the GINN, the Global Institute for Novel Nicotine's Code of Practice, an examination of best practices for quality assurance, safety standards, and regulatory compliance. Now that's quite a broad scope of topics, but we have the experts for you within there. We can get some really detailed insight into why quality and safety and standards of these products are so important. But what I'm going to do first of all is I'll just give a very brief introduction to myself, and then I'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves as well. So my name is Robert Seibon. I'm the Managing Director of Arcus Compliance. Arcus Compliance, as the name suggests, is a compliance and regulatory company that operates within the UK, Europe, and the USA. We primarily started in the vape sector, have transitioned over into doing novel nicotine products such as nic pouches, and we also do electronic compliance. So, let's go through our panel then. We'll start with ladies first. So, Rachel, if you could possibly introduce yourself to the audience.
My name is Rachel Schmidt. I recently founded A-Link Consulting when I left FDA last year. I spent the last 12 years at the Center for Tobacco Products, working in the Office of Compliance and Enforcement as an assistant director there, responsible for establishing the laboratory science related to pre- and post-market testing, product standards, and any compliance and enforcement program that needed to be enforced, unfortunately. Sorry about that. I left after, I guess, the 29th. We had a leap year last year, and so I've been gone for about a year and working with industry to try and ensure that the communication, the collaboration, and the coordination with both existing and future regulations are there. So I'm very excited to be able to talk to you all about this today and hopefully provide at least some regulatory insight and background to the whys of what GINN is trying to do here with the Code of Practice, as well as the importance in getting started as soon as possible if you have not already.
Thank you very much, Rachel. We just a brief applause for Rachel there. Thank you. Okay, we now move on to Chris Allen, CEO of Broughton.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Working? Fantastic. Hi, so I'm Chris Allen, CEO of Broughton Group. My background is medical devices, pharmaceuticals, so going all the way back to 1997 when I started in the medical device industry, working on really sort of analytical science, regulatory science. Co-founded Broughton in 2006. We actually started working on nicotine products back in 2007. So these were NRTs, so gums, patches, lozenges. A very interesting project moved us into the consumer space, and that was working on a medicinal project for a vaping product, which then sort of got us into the vapor space, Tobacco Products Directive, PMTA, and now progressing into looking at all forms of reduced risk product testing. We don't do any work on combustibles. We're not an advocate of anything combustible based, so it's purely reduced risk nicotine products. I think there's a lot of concern now with how sort of the industry is heading, the lack of regulation, and even over the past few weeks, even reputable newspapers that are putting out scare stories about how much nicotine is within a pouch. There's a very, very basic lack of understanding about the science, the toxicology behind these products, and that's leading to a lot of misinformation. So I think the work that the GINN, its members, and all the associates that are doing is fantastic in trying to change that narrative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Brief round of applause for Chris there. Thank you. And now we move on to Rob Burton, who's the Group Director of Science and Regulatory at Plexa.
Good morning, everyone. Ooh, that was loud. As Robert said, I'm the Chief Science and Regulatory Officer at Plexa. I'm an industrial chemist by background with experience in inhalation and asthma, drug device combinations for AstraZeneca, GSK. And for my sins, I joined British American Tobacco as Group Head of Public Health and Scientific Affairs, where I first got into the reduced risk nicotine areas. Followed on with running a US e-cig company, and then with Imperial. Well, I was actually with Nerudia, who got bought by Imperial, and now with Plexa as a group. We have 10 companies in 10 countries and turn over around 800 million in reduced risk products annually. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much, Rob. Brief round of applause there for Rob. And we have Waqas Khan, who's the CEO of Clue. Waqas, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Well, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to the esteemed speakers as well. Waqas Khan, I originally come from technology commercialization. I was part of a few of the Fortune 500 companies. I launched financial services, microfinance in countries which were like Unpacks with Telenor, which is a Norwegian company. I was part of launching some telecom brands and some broadband internet. For the last decade or so, I've been in the tobacco space. I was part of the team that launched the first vaping products for companies like Juul Labs, British American Tobacco products, which was called Vibe earlier, is called Views now. I've also co-founded 2-3 companies in the process. Last company that I co-founded was actually acquired by Imperial. In USA, we launched a white nicotine pouch as an experiment. It is the second largest brand now in USA. So now we have co-founded this brand, Clue. We are one of the few brands in the world that has the acceptance from US FDA. We've launched in about 20 countries so far. The focus is on improving the life of smokers across the world, and we want to position ourselves as champions around harm reduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Waqas. Brief round of applause for Waqas and our fantastic panel. Thank you very much. So what I'm going to move on with is a general question, first of all, for all four of you, and you can chip in as you like. And it's the importance, really, about a code of practice and how that contributes to quality and safety, and why you think it's so critical that GINN has put this in place. So I'm going to pick on Rachel first, I think.
I can speak really, I do a little work across the international sector, but primarily what I'm going to comment on here is from a US regulatory standpoint, because we obviously have experts here who can comment on other areas. One of the key things that I think passes quite a few companies by in their thinking when it comes to the US is that they focus on the appropriate for protection of public health. And while that is a key factor in bringing your product to market, it is only one of four things under the US Tobacco Control Act that actually can result in a denial. One of the other ones, and I think that this is a critical one that GINN is trying to address here, is that your manufacturing practices, the quality, the information, and the investigations as part of your application can alone be reason enough for FDA to deny your application. So you can have the best studies, you can have an appropriate for the protection of public health ruling from the scientists, but there is a second component to your application that you are required to submit that deals with the manufacturing and the quality of the product that you are producing. And if you cannot demonstrate that as part of bringing your product to market in the US, it is grounds for a denial, regardless of whether your product is APPH. So there's a lot of focus on APPH, as there should be. Your product should meet that standard. But if you don't manufacture it in a high quality, consistent manner and document your manufacturing processes and your quality systems appropriately, then your product, regardless of that, can be denied on the US market. One of the other factors is your advertising and labeling, which is something that the Code of Practice does address as well. False or misleading, which is a very general, open to interpretation term in the US, is that your product labeling cannot be false or misleading. So these are aspects that the GINN Code of Practice spends time on trying to set some basic guidelines and guide rails for walking your path towards getting products on the market in different regulatory environments that I think will be very useful.
Fantastic. Anybody else want to contribute?
I think following on from, really good points, Rachel, and following on from some of that, I think, these codes have got to be the basic minimum requirements that companies are adhering to, and they shouldn't be complicated for companies to actually implement. And, following on from the manufacturing comment, I think one of the big things that's missing when we've done our reviews, things as simple as a batch number. You know, there's in a lot of these products just have no batch control. Every week you see in the newspapers about food recalls, how to identify the product that actually could be harmful to your health. A lot of the nicotine products, that isn't mandated, and it's not even an expectation set by a lot of the retailers. So I think for something like this to actually be, you know, to be really effective, we've got to get really to the retailers and those supply chains picking these up. So your big supermarket chains, your Tesco's, your Sainsbury's say, look, we are not going to accept products unless they comply with this code of conduct. Otherwise, there's just not that sort of real incentive for companies to adhere to these. And the problem is the good companies that do actually have less of a competitive advantage than those that aren't, because they're not spending the money actually doing things properly. So we've got to try and sort of drive this from as many different angles. We've got to go from the top, from the regulators, we've got to go from the bottom, the consumers, the retailers, through to the manufacturers. So this has got to be a holistic approach to implementing something like this.
And it's educating consumers as well, isn't it? So that the consumer can understand and recognise a quality product.
Yes, but the question is, how much do consumers care? So if you look at smokers, for example, everybody knows smoking is going to kill them, but they're not cared about their own health. So do they really care about the quality of the products that they're actually consuming? So I think the consumers, you know, if you think about each section, you could maybe capture, you know, make a 10% difference with consumers. Could we make a 25% difference with retailers? Can we build this up through the supply chain to have the right impact?
So Wakas, I'd like to ask you now, obviously as somebody here that's producing these products, putting them on the market, how much is quality and safety? Where does it sit within your company, and how imperative and important is it?
No, very good question, and I think what, like generally first I want to pass on a compliment to GINN and the initiative as well. I think it was the need of the hour to have a voice outside a few big companies, right, who is not biased towards any of these things. For us as a brand, I think we feel we are also responsible on making sure that the right products have access to the right consumers, and regulations are, and these codes are very important. For instance, this is where we love USA, because at least there is a process in place, at least there's a way to do things, unlike many other countries which are like not there yet, right? So we as producers or manufacturers, what we are doing is that we're going into these territories, for instance, South Africa, Indonesia, Malaysia, Dubai, for instance, where there's no regulations, right? What I always say internally and externally is that we as manufacturers know what the right regulations are, what the right processes are. So facilities that we have that are producing products globally, we own that facility as well. It is FDA compliant, US FDA compliant, because that was the regulation we had. So the product that's going across from a manufacturing standpoint, right, we are making sure that the same level that is required for US is maintained for other markets as well. And then, like you were suggesting, marketing also comes into play, right? There are territories where you can go and do whatever you want to, print, radio, and TV ads. So that's where self-imposing those regulations are very important, right? And creating awareness. So whenever we go to a new market, we try and do three things as a team. Number one, we try and understand what's happening in the market. Secondly, we would meet some partners who can help us scale. And third, the most important field is we like to talk to regulators as well, health advocates as well, and create awareness. Same thing we did in South Africa as well. We're talking to a global health advocate who's a parliamentarian as well. We're trying to access the president, and the mandate is very simple: bring responsible regulations. If you don't know what those regulations are, we can help you, support, provide you with the right. Because this is a product at the end of the day that your population is consuming. This is something that's going into their body, right? So there has to be some kind of labs that do some kind of testing, which I feel was lost in the case of vaping. Now, good news is that pouches are becoming the next phenomena, so we have the room to do things the right way now.
Okay, so Rob, just moving on to you with this then. So Wakas mentioned vaping. And I'm just going a little bit off piste here then. Are there any lessons to be learned for us in terms of quality and standards that we missed out on vaping, and how we can apply this to this category?
Yeah, sure. I think we need to recognise we're in a disruptive industry. And in areas of disruption, regulation is always playing catch up. And The critical part of that is that regulators, if they're worried about these things getting out of control, they will use their precautionary principle. So they'll put regulation in place to stop that from happening. Unfortunately, most regulators then don't have the resource for enforcement. And we've seen that a lot in countries with vaping where retail bans, display bans, ingredient bans have come into force without enforcement. And what's happened is a huge illicit trade has developed, which obviously loses money for those reputable companies, but also doesn't contribute to the GDP and tax and various other things from the government point of view. So I think if we can do something in terms of setting standards in advance and almost having a self-regulating organisation, then it moves the lens of the regulator away from that area and looks more towards responsible regulation from a reduced risk perspective. If we don't and it becomes the Wild West, then we can expect the precautionary principle type regulation to come into force. And that will have those unintended consequences associated with it as well.
Yeah, and the vape industry suffered from this massively, didn't it? Where how it evolved failed to identify or failed to differentiate between the illegal and the legal market. And the two became meshed. And opinion, public opinion, governmental opinion, enforcement opinion started seeing the category as a whole and saying that it's done all these things wrong, and it didn't see the differentiation. So this is kind of almost a clarion call point, isn't it, for us to separate ourselves by using a code of practice and saying, actually, you know, we're the legitimate side of this industry.
Definitely, and there are examples. If you look at OTC pharmaceuticals in the UK, the PAGB has a self-regulating body, controls that, and almost is empowered by regulators to manage that. So it's a step between the companies and what they're doing and the regulatory authorities. And if you can develop that trust and confidence, it then relates to potential for engagement, and not necessarily to regulatory stage when these things are already being enforced, but at the policy stage where they're still being discussed.
Great, thank you. Chris, if we can just move on to the principles of the GINN Code of Practice, and what are the foundations within that? So what sort of regulatory practice or guidance have we used to support and create that GINN Code of Practice?
From my perspective, I think there's been some good pragmatic inputs into this. So looking at sort of elements like the PAS guidance from BSIs, there's also the Gothatec standard from Sweden. But I think really the purpose of it is, as I say, just laying out those sort of core minimum requirements that are not too complicated to meet. This hasn't gone over the top in terms of expectations of GMP in the pharmaceutical industry, but it's just taking, it's almost sort of the best parts of lots of sort of different guidances and pulling that together into one single document.
Yeah, it's great, and I know you've been a key contributor to the document. I was having a read of it last night. There's some great stuff in there, which I think, as you've positioned, puts it very well. It doesn't overreach, but I think it's also could act potentially as a foundation for regulation moving forward, where the regulator may look at that document and say, well, this is sensible regulation. And was that in the back of your mind when you were assisting authoring it?
I think it's got to be. It's got to be something that can evolve. You know, if you go in sort of too hard, too quickly, you're just going to push people away. I mean, even if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, I mean, GMP does scare a lot of people off, but GMP has evolved over 30, 40, 50 years. And you know, if you go back to GMP, even when we started Broughton back in 2006, a completely different beast to what it is now. Even though a lot of the actual regulation itself hasn't changed, it's how inspectors actually change their viewpoints of that regulation, how it's implemented. So you've got to talk about regulation as an evolution that's got to change as the industry changes. So if you go in something too direct from the start, that's when people find loopholes. You know, we've seen this with the Tobacco Products Directive, the 2 ml limit and the 10 ml bottle, and then people go, brilliant, let's just put those together. You know, that's an unintended consequence of the regulation not being right in the first place and not creating products that consumers actually want.
Thanks for that, Chris. Rob, moving on and talking about how the regulatory environment is evolving, What's your view on the evolvement of the regulatory environment at the moment?
I think there's a number of areas of concern, and they overlap with what we've seen in other areas for vaping, and prior to that in OTC medicines and even statins and their public usage. I think there's if you want to look at some basic principles, I mean, there's youth protection, product quality, child protection as well, environmental impact, and then underlying all of that is responsible marketing. And I think pulling all those together as a code of practice in advance of regulation can demonstrate that we're actually taking this responsibly. We're ethical organisations. And when the headlines come through, and often these newspaper headlines that come through are not well educated, they're in the minority, but they capture the time, they capture the noise. And when they do that, it's difficult to respond because it's already out there instantly. And whatever you do from an ethical point of view after that, you're always all tarred with that same brush. And I think we need to be at the forefront of setting standards responsibly across all those different areas. And I think if that's the learning from other industries, other areas as well, let's not wait for them to catch up. Let's set it now and actually set the market and keep that market open as a reduced risk product.
See you pick up the mic there, Rachel. Go on.
I just wanted to add my 2 cents on that. I was at FDA and at CDC for EVO. You do not want that to be how anyone learns about your devices, your products. You do not want to be on the news with 16, 17, 18-year-olds in the hospital with a type of pneumonia that no one can identify, and subsequently having a percentage of them die. That's not how you want to start. It's not how any industry wants their products to be painted in the media. So once you've gone that far, once you have a dual epidemic with vaping, when you have kids all over the place using it in the high schools and the middle school, once you have an adverse event or an emergency response of that scope, it's very difficult in a regulatory environment, and I can speak for the US, to recover from that. People, you can't get off that train after. So I think it's absolutely critical from the GINN practice to start correctly, as you all have been very clearly stated, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Perfect should never be the enemy of good enough. You don't have to know everything to start. You see it, I know, in quality assurance with manufacturing, with laboratories. You don't put a good quality management system in overnight, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't start establishing one if you don't have one yet. So, and I think that's what the practice speaks to. These are the basic foundational building blocks. Here's a place to start, and encouraging people to make sure that they do start.
So going to manufacturing then, Wakas, what strategies can manufacturers employ then to effectively communicate potential product risks and benefits?
Good question. So I think from a manufacturing standpoint, one of the basic things one need to make sure is that don't compromise on the ingredients, right? Because your facility might be FDA accepted, so you have to make sure the raw materials, the flea, like for instance in this case, in case of a pouch, right? The flavors, the raw materials, the nicotine, where it's coming from, right? Second thing is enforcement within the facility as well, right? Because FDA or regulators are not going to be there all the time. So making sure you're doing it for the right reasons, and then handling it properly as well when it goes to those places, right? Sometimes the handling, the way it moves from one place to another basically affects the product quality as well. And from a consumer standpoint as well, this is something I want to say using the forum, it's the same consumer technically. We have some new entrants coming to the category as well, which was the same case with vaping. But predominantly this journey started off with premium cigarette smokers switching into premium vaping products like Juul, and when they were not able to find flavors of their choice due to regulations or nicotine strengths, they started entering the oral nicotine category. So one fact that we know about these consumers for a while, they don't compromise on quality and they're not price sensitive. They are willing to pay the right price for the right product, so it's not a price war, right? It makes sense not to cut corners on the product quality, which is all safe, and it also helps the product convert into repeat sales. That's what every brand owner wants at the end of the day.
So I just want to move on to some standards within the marketplace and actually what we're seeing now and whether or not that creates alerts. So Chris, I know you've done a little bit of work with trading standards in the UK and you've reviewed a number of products. Can you just give us an overview of what the sort of regulatory compliance was like with the products that you assessed?
Am I allowed to swear?
No.
Okay, not very good. We're talking some of the most basic standards. So in the UK, we have the General Product Safety Regulation, and even sort of prior to testing any of the products, this is just the labelling of the products. About 30% of the products that were picked up off shelves in the UK didn't comply with GPSR. Around about 50% of them didn't comply with CLP. We also compared them against the PAS document that, anything from a GINN standard wasn't available at that time, so we used the BSI PAS document, and only 10% of products would sort of be deemed to comply from that from a visual perspective. So that's even before trying to understand anything about the manufacturing processes. But a lot of these products just weren't even in English. They're just basically shipped over straight from Sweden, other countries, put on the shelves in the UK. So there is very, very little control. But trading standards are trying to get to grips with that. But we both know, Rob, they're massively under-resourced. And that's the case across the world in terms of enforcement.
Yeah, and it begs the questions about the push and pull scenario, doesn't it? Where we are pushing with enforcement for compliance, but pulling the consumer into looking for quality products and ensuring they're there. And I think that one of the things that we have got to do about this code of practice and focusing on quality and safety is somehow educate the consumer to look for that and to look for a quality product. There's a why though here, isn't there? So you've viewed these products, these 50-odd products, you've seen the compliance standards as poor. Why? Why do we think that is? What's the reasons behind that? I'm pretty sure I know the answer myself, but it'd be nice to hear from you.
It's speed to market, it's profit, but part of this is driven by the consumer themselves because people are buying these products. People want them. And we've seen this with the whole illicit vape space in the UK. The current restrictions prevent people from getting products that last them longer than half a day to a day. So I think the regulators have got to sort of understand what's actually happening in the market. But at the moment, because there is literally, there's zero regulation in there already for pouches other than GPSR, there's no penalty for these companies. It's an easy way for people to make money quickly by bringing the cheapest product in. And I will still come back to the point I raised earlier. Consumers, not every consumer, but a lot of consumers don't care about quality. The absolute sort of rubbish we just sort of fill our homes with. Some people like that longevity, and yes, we'll invest in quality. A lot of consumers don't care. Consumers care about sort of the taste sensation, the nicotine effect. Is this actually giving them the sensation that they want? So as I said before, we've got to attack this from a number of different angles to be able to overcome these illicit products.
So it occurs to me that the risk profile of our consumers is, they're quite prepared to accept high risk, and therefore we've got to supplement that with some type of regulation or code to drive standards to ensure the quality and safety of a product for the consumer, rather than expecting the consumer to enforce that themselves and say, with their pocket, I'm not going to buy that product because I don't think it's very good.
Yeah, I think it's got to be a combination. There's a combination of different factors, and I think always the concern, if you go too hard trying to educate consumers about poor quality products, they put all products within that category, and it can damage confidence in that sector. So I think it's about a sort of softly approach in terms of education, because the worst case is we go straight to these scare stories. There was one in the Telegraph, I think 4 weeks ago. just about, you know, the amount of nicotine contained in a pouch. You know, one pouch contains the equivalent of 10 cigarettes. Scare story, kids are using them, these are not detectable. Here we go again. It's exactly the same story as the vaping case.
Yes, history rewriting itself again, isn't it? Yes, Rob?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, that actually I don't think consumers understand this because they see a product on the marketplace and therefore assume that it's okay, it's been authorised, there's a reason why it's on the marketplace. I would also say that from an ethical point of view, the approach we've taken, and most of the companies that I work with take, is that this is a tobacco harm reduction product. It's moving people away on the continuum of risk from high-risk products like combustible cigarettes to lower-risk products and even out of the nicotine category altogether. It's not about attracting new, naive users, underage users, and those types of people into nicotine. It's about providing smokers with a reduced risk alternative that allows them to have a better quality of life. And around the marketing principles, that's where we should be focusing, is asking that question. I mean, the US obviously is in the interest of public health, or from a substantial equivalence point of view, does it raise additional questions? Our question is always, how does this fit on a risk continuum in terms of moving smokers and other combustible and non-combustible tobacco users to lower risk alternatives?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, well, I was going to move on to you, Rachel, there, so go on, add in.
So I just wanted to comment, I think that you raised a very good point about education regarding the quality of the products, but I do think that while that should always be an end goal, that consumers know what they're putting in their body, that there's a massive amount of misinformation, especially within the US, about the continuum of risk. I think the UK does this much better than the US regulatory agencies do, but it's difficult to move consumers to high quality products when they're still struggling with the idea of which tobacco products actually are less harmful, and in some instances just the basic question of whether nicotine causes cancer. You know, this amount of misinformation that is perpetuated through medical and health personnel, even to consumers, causes confusion on a very basic level that gets in the way before they can even address quality of the product that they're using. So it's a massive problem in the US, absolutely.
And I suspect Sayara will probably talk about nicotine when she does her panel, so I don't really want to go into that too in depth because the demonisation of nicotine is a real issue in terms of that, like you said, Chris. You know, this comparison between a nicotine pouch and 10 cigarettes. There is no comparison. You know, it's quite ridiculous, isn't it? But moving back to the quality and safety then and the codes of practice. Can I just ask you, Rachel, and thank you very much for your contribution as well, and all the panellists for the GINN Codes of Practice. Can I just ask you about what mechanisms exist to monitor and ensure members comply with the code?
So the Code of Practice is written to provide a base level of information and recommendations on how to comply. It gives, at least initially, I think, sort of a matrix of, you know, what should be done, what must be done, and what could be done, and allows the manufacturer to take those basic principles of what are the regulations within the market you're trying to enter. Are there standards in the countries that you have available, or are there standards across the board? Just because you're not marketing in the UK doesn't mean you can't use the standard for nicotine pouches, to make sure that they're educating themselves, and then where a standard is not available, to use the best available science to try and define the foundational rules or requirements for your own product. It's very difficult to have a one-size-fits-all, and it shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all. But I think the GINN Code of Practice provides a pathway and some guidance on how to make the determinations for your product in the countries and regulatory environments that you're working, and the standards that may or may not be available. And if there are no regulations, if there are no standards, encourages those to reach to the science and find a baseline for your product that makes sense.
Thank you very much. Right, Wakask, a question for you. Within the manufacturing piece, how important is training and development to support quality standards for these products then? What training and development do you give to your staff? How do you guide them to ensure they keep high standards?
I think it's very important, right, to find, number one, to find the right people as well, right? Especially talking about this category in particular, right? In my last role, I set up one of the largest manufacturing facilities in North America, which is part of Imperial now. So one of the biggest challenges we faced was to find the people to run the facility. There was no one there, right? We actually had to bring in people from Europe to come in, right? So now, in light of that, we have, number one, set up labs, right? In Dubai, India, USA, Baltimore, and we found the right people who have the experience to bring in. So that's very important. And number two, regular training, onboarding as part of internal SOP. I think it's super critical. This is something we have learned after entering this category. And I do want to make a small comment on the regulation piece or code piece as well. I think what happened, this is how I saw the industry evolve. Like, industry was on the right track, right? There were few handful brands in vaping. From the scientific side of it, if I refer to Health UK, vaping is actually less harmful as compared to smoking cigarette, right? If it is coming from a regulatory body. And we were on track until brands like Juul got targeted, right? And we know where the influence was coming from as well, right? So right now, and this is where I love GINN and the initiatives this group is taking, and we love to be part of it, because we need right kind of influence, not biased influence, right, to come in. And then we also saw when these regulations eventually came in for vaping, they were not supportive of any legit brands, right? And I can give you a number of examples. For instance, one example is Dubai, right? Dubai has regulation, Dubai has asthma, everything, right? But 99% of the brands that are selling in UAE are all illicit. Same is the case with US as well, which is lack of enforcement. So yes, we know we don't have enough resources to do enforcement, so might as well bring regulations that leave room for legit players to still play the game, right? With a little difference of opinion on the pricing piece as well, because this is something we saw as well, right? Back in 2017, 2018, 2019, whenever you went to any store across the globe, and I'm talking about the vaping era, you went to any store across the globe, there were two types of product sitting in stores. Device was also coming from China. Even BAT had to go to China to get the device, right? But the liquid was differentiated. It was coming from China, and then there was second quality of liquid that was coming from US or Europe, which was regulated. So two types of devices sitting in a store. You went in, you asked them, same specs. How much is this one for? $30. How much is this one for? $10. Which one is selling more? The one that's $30 gives me 90% of the volume, right? That was the time when legit players were playing the game. A lot of these illicit players did not even know what the right, and consumer prefers quality. After about 10 years now, these companies out of China or different parts of the world have learned how to make the liquid now, right? It's the same quality now, right? So you leave room there, which hampered the ability for any legit players who were playing the right way. And now you've created a monster for yourself. You can't enforce, you can't regulate, right? And it's only gonna get worse, right? News came out today, US is putting new tariffs on products that are coming in. It would all come down to enforcement now, right? Whoever is planning to bring 26%, 29%, 30% tariff, right? So of course, if there is no enforcement, legit players are gonna lose, right? So this is where I felt consumer was willing to pay the right price for the product unless the quality became the same, quality from a consumer lens, and the price, of course, then they would pay less. There was a slight difference of opinion, where we saw this consumer was not price sensitive initially to begin with. but right regulations, leaving room for legit players to play the game, and influence from neutral bodies like GINN can come in and put the right word, because we've seen these governments getting influenced, right? We have two precedents right now. One is Health Canada, one is in USA. US classifies this as a tobacco product, Canada classifies this as a natural health product. I was on table with Health Canada. This regulation was supposed to come in 2021, right? It got delayed. But the major influence behind that regulation came from British American Tobacco, right? It is the only company, Zonic is the only brand that's still, right, legit in Canada, nobody else. So different countries are playing with this category differently. This is where I feel need of the hour dictates some neutral players to come in, create the right kind of noise for the right reasons.
Thank you very much. Well, the time's getting on, so I'd just like to give the opportunity to anybody in the audience if they've got any questions for our esteemed panel.
Vaka from British American Tobacco. You were mentioning at multiple points the youth access, and throughout the panel we were talking about sort of two camps of players, the legit and the non-legit. I myself work in regulatory affairs in Brussels, and the debate there almost doesn't care who is who. So my question to you, and I think this may be the answer to it, is how do we externally differentiate it? So when we have a debate with the regulators, it's not, oh, you're the guys that are just pushing that to kids, or you're the guys that have 50 milligram nicotine pouch. So how do you externally communicate, and how can we divide these two camps in a court of public opinion?
So it's become a hot mic.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. I think you're right. I think the industry setting standards like this is the starting point, but I think those standards also have to be realistic and achievable, but have to evolve over time. And that evolution comes with both the consumer understanding, regulatory development, understanding other areas that will come into effect, such as taxation. Because that's the other thing governments like to do. As soon as something becomes popular, they look at tax and excise as a way of actually generating income, which is great. I'm fully supportive of that, providing then we can use that funding to enforce against the illicit trade. And that's the unintended consequence of regulation coming in force. But yeah, setting standards and getting almost like, I mean, we talked earlier on about having some sort of symbol or recognition of a product quality. Something like that, I think, on a pack or endorsed, or is then recognised not just by the industry but by external bodies, regulators, whatever it is. That here is like a KITE stamp or a BSI mark, or that, you know, FDA authorised. I've never used FDA approved, by the way, but that's excellent. So I think setting the standards is the starting point. I think that does two things. It's mitigate against the precautionary principles like regulation, because they see you're taking the responsibility to this. But also what it starts to do is the ability to differentiate between the good players and the bad players. And then as a self-regulating body, almost go to trading standards, go to the regulation and say, look, these guys are operating outside our scope, we don't approve of that. Don't regulate us out of tobacco harm reduction. Enforce against those guys that are the bad players, and we will help you manage that.
It gives you a voice. It opens the door.
So I'd like to just comment on that, because you did bring up FTA. So I think it's absolutely critical, and I'm gonna repeat what you said. Achievable. The standards need to be achievable. No one likes to play a rigged game. And if it is a rigged game, if no matter how hard you work, no matter how many steps you take, you cannot achieve a regulated product on the market, then no one wants to play. And that's not what we're trying to achieve here. I don't think that's what GINN's trying to achieve. I think that's unfortunately, unintentionally, what the US has achieved. It is so difficult to bring a product to market that people look for workarounds. They look for a way to get a stamp of we're not illicit right now through enforcement discretion, but are not necessarily willing to take the process all the way to the end, because what they've seen is it doesn't make a difference. So, and that's detrimental to every regulatory landscape, no matter what your product is. You have to give people a legitimate chance and pathway to become a regulated product. And if it isn't, if they don't see it as legitimate, there's no benefit to having it. The other thing is, and I agree completely with GINN, is that at least within the US, currently the Center for Tobacco Products under FDA, which has had some rather significant changes this week, did not have a mechanism to recognize standard organizations or standards externally. Lots of offices within FDA do have that ability, medical devices for sure, where the regulatory agency doesn't have to develop their own standards. They can simply go out and say, we like that one, and that one. If you do that, and you note it in your application, we just check off that those requirements are met. And prior to this week's massive changes, I do know that within the FDA, they were working on creating a list of recognized standards across product classes that they could reference, because it's not written into their code of regulations yet, like it is with other centers. They were working towards that so that bodies like GINN, things that they did through compliance and enforcement discretion with the UL standard for devices, that more actions like that could be taken to provide guidance for manufacturers.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions from the audience? Oh, there's one over here. There you go, so just briefly introduce yourself.
My name is Edmund Schleman, and I'm from Vont, Sweden. We're a manufacturer of vaping products and nicotine pouch products. So in Sweden, snus and nicotine pouch is part of their culture. My question to Rachel is this, is that we've seen in the market ridiculously high strength nicotine pouches like 30 milligram and 50 milligram, which we feel it's a disaster. Just the background, in Sweden, the most popular strength nicotine pouches are 9 milligram, 12, 9 milligram. So has the FDA regulation put a maximum limit on the strength of nicotine pouches? That's a question for you. And for Wackas, as a manufacturer of nicotine pouches, do you have a company policy on that? And what is your advice and recommendations for other manufacturers? Thank you.
So the simple answer to that question is no. The more complicated answer to that question is it's a hot mess. So within the FDA, I know that I do work with the Caresto work groups, working also with the tags under the ISO standards, working with GINN, and then I worked on a product standard that would have addressed some of this prior to leaving FDA. There is a lot of confusion around what that limit should be, and then also in the labeling of products. So is it 30 milligrams per gram of tobacco and your pouch has 0.2 grams of tobacco in it? Is it a percentage of nicotine? Is it per pouch? And I know that some of the standards in the UK and within Sweden have addressed those. It has not yet been addressed within the United States. There's also a lot of science that goes into that would be very difficult to convey. How are you complexing your nicotine in your pouches? Is it free nicotine? Is it complex with the polyacrylics? What type of nicotine are you using in your pouches, which leads to a whole different level of complication as to what the consumer actually gets out of the pouch.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm going to go because we're running out of time. So, Wackas?
Good question. So, like Rachel said, no in US, but it's not a problem in US yet because US market, majority of the market is between 6 and 9. If you went 2 years back, it was 3 and 6. So consumers are not asking for high nicotine strength. But there are countries like Russia, for instance, Saudi Arabia, for instance, right, where consumers are have a bit extremist mindset, and Let me give you an example of Russia, for instance, right? Russia is one of the largest markets for snus, tobacco snus, outside Nordic. When white nicotine pouches were launched in Russia, it was massive demand for the product because the use case was already there. Consumer demanded for a 50 mg, 100 mg, 150 mg pouch. Companies provided them with that. More than 200 people died of heart attacks. So for us as a company, we have a policy. We will never manufacture a product in white nicotine pouch which is above 20, right? Even 20, in most of the cases we try and shy away from 20, but we are not selling anything beyond 20. And believe me, we have these partners who come to us and they ask for, give me 10 containers, 20 containers, 50 containers, right? If you give me 50 mg, please give it a hard no. Two things we are seeing. Number one, people are mostly mislabeling. I don't believe that it's possible to handle a 50 or 100 mg pouch, right? Because the consumer asks for it, companies mislabel it. I know personally, I'm not going to take any names. I know companies who are mislabeling the product because when we put our 15 mg next to their 50 mg, consumer is able to handle that 50 mg, not our 15 mg, meaning they are mislabeling the product. But as a company policy, we will not do anything beyond 20.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Well, we're out of time. I just want to take the opportunity, first of all, to thank our members here today and their contribution to this particular briefing and this particular discussion, also their contribution to the GINN Codes of Practice, which has been fantastic. I would also like to explain to the crowd that GINN is looking for members. And if you want to join GINN, you are actively encouraged to do so. And you see that gentleman at the back there that stood behind the camera, that's Shem, who is our Director General. You can go and see Shem and have a conversation with him. He'll quite gladly bring you on board. But it's important to be involved so that we can influence the regulatory landscape, map, whatever you want to call it, of this category moving forward, and we don't make the same mistakes as the vaping industry did. But could you please take a moment to put your hands together to thank our fantastic panel. It's been a really good discussion. Thank you very much.